Hello, everybody. Pastor Connor here. I just figured I'd hop on. We'll start ourselves a new little series. This is going to be on a modern kind of Lutheran work. This is from Dr. Paul Hinlicky, and this is Lutheran Theology, a Critical Introduction. We're going to be taking this chapter by chapter, looking through each of his thoughts, all of his concepts that he's giving to us, and we're going to break it down, talk about it and at the end of it, hopefully, glean some information, something thought-provoking, something interesting. And I hope to be able to do this bit by bit, maybe in half-hour episodes or whatever. My kids are around, so hopefully you don't hear them through the mic. Um, but here we go. Anyways, I've always liked Dr. Paul Hinlicky's books. He is a professor at the Institute of Lutheran Theology, and um, he has a podcast. So if you're interested in kind of a broader idea, theme, scope of what we're going to be covering in this series, probably, uh, I don't know how many chapters this is, but however many chapters there are in the book is how many episodes we'll be doing. This is the book. I just have a my own little Kindle version. I guess you can't see that because it's mirrored, but yeah, it's like 9.99 Canadian on Kindle, so it's no big deal. You can pick it up, you can read along. So here we go. Introduction. Let's just dive right into this. So he's talking from a perspective of very recent written note here. And I don't know exactly when this book was published. I guess I can just go to the front matter and figure that out. But he's already at the beginning. He's talking about how the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation took place recently when he wrote this. So it says here, um, copyright 2020. So there you go, from 2020. So he's writing very recently. Well, not very recently. He is writing very recently, but he's writing with the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation in his recent memory. And he's talking about how in the wake of that Reformation anniversary, tons of people were making claims about Lutheranism, saying, Lutheranism is this or Lutheranism is that, and then talking about how, for example, Lutheranism through the ages has developed, how Lutheranism is this kind of bulwark of modern Renaissance progressive ideology for some people. Other people were talking about how Lutheranism is this great pillar of traditional Protestantism and the magisterial Reformation. Other people still were talking about how Lutheranism is really about this Catholic renewal and retrieval movement going back to the Holy Fathers of the patristic age in the early church, and how we need to get back to that. Other people still were talking about how Lutheranism is this kind of font of schism that broke and separated the church into 1,000 different fractured little pieces. And so he's saying there is always about this Lutheranism when we're talking about it, this kind of um, conflict in definition that nobody can actually agree on what Lutheranism is. So he says here, in fact, naming this tradition of Christian theological reflection, Lutheran itself is controversial. And that's true, right? Just as naming it, for example, Protestant is controversial, or naming it Evangelical Catholic is controversial. Talking about what confessions we have as a church is controversial. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but we've been walking through in our series through the Augsburg Confession, and in the break of that, in the middle of that, there is an article in which our our confessional divine Philip Melanchthon states, um, depending on how you read it, basically, we are just trying to reaffirm the ancient Western Catholic faith. That's what we are. He says we've deviated not at all from the teachings of the ancient Western Catholic Church. We've deviated not at all, even, he says, from the Roman Church. All we have done is criticize some of these abuses and express desire to go back to that more traditional foundational understanding of the church. And so in that episode, when I was talking about that, I was making the point, as has been made by others, and you can go and you can see this on, for example, Gottesdienst, their podcasts, their articles, their blogs, those thinkers, they're, of course, the guys that are working on the Lutheran Missal Project. It's not hard to find very Catholically oriented Lutherans. At the same time, it's not very hard at all either to find very Protestant-y Lutherans who understand their Lutheranism and orient their Lutheranism not around liturgy and mass and vestments and tradition and holy fathers, but orient their Lutheranism upon the solas. right? And they're trying to do something that's maybe slightly different from what you might see in a German Reformed or a Dutch Reformed congregation, but not by that much. You know what I mean? Like you walk into some pietist congregations and you can't really tell, is that Lutheran or is that some kind of other Protestant unless you really know, like you're really familiar with what you're talking about. But for the average person, it's sometimes indistinguishable. You know, you walk into some of those lower church pietistic Lutheran congregations and you're making the sign of the cross. Goodness me, you walk into a Wells congregation and make the sign of the cross, people are going to get upset about it. Wells Lutherans don't make the sign of the cross. Of course, we know in the small catechism, Luther says, when you wake up, make the sign of the cross. And this is all proving Hinlicky's point that Lutheranism is a tradition in conflict with itself, that Lutheranism as a definition, even Lutheranism, he says, is the name Lutheran is something that we have fights with ourselves on, let alone, or maybe that's a improper way of saying that. That's not even to say anything about the fights we get into with other people who aren't Lutherans, right? Do we kind of get what he's saying there? And so he's beginning this book by saying, well, what is this book supposed to do? He's saying, well, it's going to give you a picture of how Lutheranism has changed and transformed. And so one of his points here, he says Lutheranism, even when you look at its dogma, at its doctrines, which some would presuppose to be this kind of, unchanging, static, written code, is something that was even before it was written in that code, which obviously, 1580 Book of Concord, that itself is you can see the progress along the lines of it. And if anybody has listen to the whole breadth of our series on the Augsburg Confession, you'll see me talk about that, especially in the episode on the cult of the saints and the differences between, for example, Luther's small called articles and Philip Melanchthon's Augsburg Confession and Apology to the Augsburg Confession on the same idea, right? You can look at the difference there between the way that, for example, the small catechism and the large catechism speak of the doctrine of sanctification, and then the way that that same doctrine, that same term is used almost entirely differently in the Formula of Concord. You can look at the way that righteousness is defined between the Augsburg Confession or even the Catechism, or even the small called articles, and then go to the formula, right? So the formula is showing a much later stage of development in theology than is the earlier documents. And some people will get upset at me for saying that, right? In a simple historical sense, that's obviously true. And that's not bad. And the Formula of Concord notes that, right? The Formula of Concord states, previously this term has only been used up until this point in the Book of Concord in this certain way. But now in this formula, we are going to use it in this sense also, right? It's not a problem at all. Um, but it's something that we need to note when we're talking about Lutheranism, what Lutheranism is, and the history of it. And this is something that for those who hang out on Discord with me, or if elsewhere online, or even if you try to do Lutheranism on the internet, you're going to find out pretty quickly there are a lot of people in the world who think, Lutheranism is my version of Lutheranism, and nobody else's version of Lutheranism is valid at all. And so they'll say, for example, if you're not in the Missouri Synod, you're not a Lutheran. Or they'll say, and this is something that's said all the time, the ELCA is not Lutheran. Well, in what sense? Like, sure, we can make that claim, right? We can say the ELCA is so distanced from traditional Lutheranism that it's a completely different thing altogether. But the flat statement of they're not Lutheran, we are, first of all, doesn't recognize that there has been a change, no matter what synod you're in, from the time of that historic Lutheranism and even historical Lutheranism itself. Like, let's get a grip, guys. There is a difference in development between Martin Luther himself and the scholastics who were working on the Formula of Concord. There are differences, even, dare I say, between Melanchthon and Luther. That doesn't mean that they are groundbreaking, essential differences, that they are, in two different churches, that they are two different theologies. That's not what that means, right? But that there is a kind of dynamic nature to what we're talking about. And this goes to in application to any church, right? Not just the Lutheran Church. But when we're looking at the Lutheran Church, being realistic about what we're talking about, being analytic to an extent, and saying, yes, we see there is Missouri theology over here, that this is the anti-Missouri Brotherhood of the Ohio Synod, the Tennessee Synod. This is, 100, 200 years ago in Lutheran theology in North America. Well, they're not the same thing. They have set each other up in mutually opposing positions. There's some kind of dynamic nature to this conversation. And so, as Hinlicky's writing his introduction here, he's kind of opening this up for us, and he's talking about the different ways that Lutheranism is viewed. So, I named some, of course, already, talking about how Lutheranism is viewed as that first font of schism and the fragmenting of the church. Some people view Lutheranism as Protestant in a very Protestanty kind of Protestant sense. Other people view Lutheranism as evangelical Catholicism and this retrieval back to that patristic age, or a retrieval of everything that came before these Roman accretions, as maybe Gavin Ortlund might say something similar to that. Other people view Lutheranism as the beginning of this progressive kind of renewal and this um, embrace of science and rationality and reason. Some people talk about how Lutheranism is this break from, and I know my old Synod president, who is now, I guess, Synod President Emeritus, Ed Skutchak of the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations, believes this very much, that Lutheranism is this fundamental break with medieval scholasticism, from that toward a Bible alone theology. And my assistant pastor believes that as well. That's his whole thing. That's how he views Lutheranism. Someone like myself, what do I view Lutheranism as? Well, I've done many episodes on this, guest episodes with friends on their channels. And even on here, I believe fundamentally Lutheranism is about the absolution, the forgiveness of sins through word and through sacrament, about the incarnate God coming into our manifest presence. And if we talk about anything that Hinlicky has henceforth named or thus named previously, I would say probably that idea of going back to the early church, in a kind of, how would we say it? Maybe a primitive Catholicism. Yeah, sure. I think that's probably where I would land, but very much on that um, um, extreme emphasis on the forgiveness of sins and on the incarnation of Christ and on sacramentality itself. Like, that's for me, that's the Lutheranism that I do. Of course, it's liturgical. You can see from the background, people who watch this channel, you all know liturgical Lutheranism, I think, is the Lutheranism. And I think I have good confessional grounds to say that, right? AP 24, paragraph 1, we retain, this is a confessional stance, we retain the liturgy, the vestments, the mass, the order of readings, and so on, right? These are part of the confession that I view as inherent to my understanding of Lutheranism. But then again, right, I'm not blind to the fact that a lot of Lutherans, or Lutherans, right, and this is why, like, this whole introduction to Hinlicky's book is so hilarious to me, because in one way it's so obvious, and yet in another way it's something that nobody likes to talk about without giving the caveat of, like, yeah, there are different Lutherans, but they're not Lutherans. You know what I'm saying? Like, because we all have this problem, right? The pietists look at me and they say, well, that's not what Luther was getting at. Whereas I look at them and I say, well, that's obviously at odds with AP 24:1. Other people will look at me and say, well, you insisting on AP 24:1 is contrary to the Formula of Concord. I think it's Article 10, or maybe it's Article 12, and that being on Adiaphora, whichever article that is. It's either 10 or 12. And so you have this hilarious kind of problem when we talk about Lutheranism. What is it we're talking about? A lot of people are going to want to ground that on the confessions, but as I said earlier, and as has been said in other kinds of podcasts that we've done at TTM, there are different synods that disagree on what to confess. Like my congregation, St. Matthew's in Cornwall, Ontario. Please visit us if you're off on a Sunday. Um, we confess the whole 1580 Book of Concord, right? But Calc, our association, doesn't actually bind us to that. They bind us to the Augsburg Confession and the Small Catechism, right? So you have this kind of difference where Missouri Synod's confessing the full Book of Concord. Other synods are only confessing the Augustana and the Small Catechism. Other synods, right? You get the idea. In Europe, it's very common to confess the Book of Concord minus, for example, the Formula of Concord. Other Lutherans in Europe will just confess the Augustana and the Small Catechism, just like you see the Pietists doing here in North America, just like you see those of Scandinavian heritage used to do here in North America. And so when we talk about Lutheranism bound in the confessions, we have to realize what that means differs because not all Lutheran synods agree on what confessions. And so if we say, well, Lutheranism is bound up just in the Augustana, well, then you're at a really slippery slope, right? Because a lot of those things that are historically Lutheran for a lot of us are in those other documents, right? That notion of the liturgy, the church orders that we're used to, that kind of Lutheran culture, the kind of Lutheran preaching, the homiletic, all of that stuff, that culture, that tradition, that heritage, that liturgy is not actually found within the Augustana. And we can make claims like, well, yeah, AP 24:1 is alluded to in AC 24. It becomes this kind of wrestling over the minutia and the implications rather than coming to grips with obvious objective morality as it stands before us in our neighbors. Do you know what I'm saying? And so when Hinlicky is talking about all of these different understandings of Lutheranism, what he's talking about is this, maybe we could call it a kind of postmodern epistemology. That doesn't mean that there is no truth or that truth is entirely subjective or that what Lutheranism is depends on what you think Lutheranism is. But what it does mean is we are all stupid and blind, and we have to kind of presuppose that there isn't this kind of, well, if you just look hard enough, you'll very obviously realize what Lutheranism definitively is. Like, if you read enough, you'll realize that the Missouri Synod is real Lutheranism and nothing else is real Lutheranism, right? There comes a kind of epistemological coming to grips with the fact that there are different perspectives on this, and um, we can't just expect people to come to the same conclusions that we do through reason, through rationality, through this kind of enlightenment, modernist sort of use of intellect. That's just not how it works, right? And that's a very complicated, complex kind of thing that needs to be discussed on its own time. But what we're seeing here is already in this introduction, Hinlicky is opening his readers up to this idea of walking through Lutheranism as a development, as it changes through time. From, for example, Luther, even in Luther's own life, starting from within the Roman Catholic Church and trying to just slightly reform it, to then seeing that the Pope is actually the one that's largely behind the indulgences and that he's condemned him, and then condemning the Pope in turn, and then writing those three treatises, and then hardening his position, and then taking a hardline stance on, for example, the bondage of the will, which then, this is not even just skip Melanchthon already, right? And there's disagreements there too. And then you go all the way to the Formula of Concord's Article 11 on the doctrine of election looks very different from the bondage of the will, even though it cites the bondage of the will. In Luther, you don't really see the scholastic method alive and at work, but you do in Melanchthon and in the Formulators. And so there is within Lutheranism, even in that confessional era, a kind of changing, a kind of stretching, a kind of developing. And then, of course, we know that continues forward through the history of Lutheranism, which we're going to look at in the rest of these chapters. So that's just the introduction. And he's given us something to chew on, to look at as we move forward and continue through this sort of path of progress, looking at Lutheranism in his critical introduction there too. So I hope this was fun, and I hope you didn't hear too much of my toddlers and infants screaming through the mic. God bless you. I'll see you later.